There exists a fatal flaw, a recurring historical pattern that has brought every great empire to its knees. It is not the drama of conquest or the fire of revolution that topples them, but something far more insidious: economic implosion, driven specifically by the collapse of their currency. This isn't just a coincidence. It is a blueprint for ruin that repeats with chilling precision every single time. Consider Rome, an empire that commanded the known world for 5 centuries, which ultimately crumbled when its currency became fundamentally worthless. Then there was Spain, a nation that controlled more gold and silver than any other in history, yet spiraled into bankruptcy until its global dominion dissolved. Even the mighty British Empire, which ruled global trade for 200 years, saw its power evaporate within a decade after its currency buckled under the weight of its own debt. 4 times in recorded history, a dominant empire has marched down this exact path to self-destruction. It begins with military overextension, followed by unsustainable spending. This leads to currency debasement, or what we now call money printing, which inevitably sparks rampant inflation. The final acts are a catastrophic loss of confidence, and then total collapse. And in every single instance, the leaders in charge were convinced they were the exception, that their empire was special, and that the old rules simply did not apply to them. They were, of course, wrong every single time. Right now, in the year 2025, the United States is tracing this exact same pattern, hitting every single warning sign along the way. The only real question is whether we are witnessing the beginning of this process, find ourselves mired in the middle, or are teetering on the edge of the end. This is the story of how empires engineer their own demise through their currency, how it happened to Rome, Spain, and Britain, and why every historical indicator suggests it is happening all over again. Let us begin our journey with Rome, the superpower that dominated Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East for over 500 years. At its zenith, Rome governed 60 million people across 3 continents. Its military was without equal, its infrastructure was the envy of the world, and its currency, the denarius, was the gold standard of trust from the drizzly shores of Britain to the sun-scorched lands of Egypt. The denarius, introduced in 211 BC, was a simple silver coin containing about 4.5 grams of pure silver. For centuries, it maintained its value because the Roman government diligently protected its purity. When you held a denarius, you knew precisely what you had: pure silver, a tangible and real store of value. This foundation of trust is what allowed Rome to finance its relentless expansion, pay its legions, and construct its magnificent infrastructure. But as it turns out, running an empire is an incredibly expensive hobby. With every passing generation, Rome's borders pushed further outward. Each new territory demanded more soldiers, more forts, more roads, and more bureaucrats, eventually costing more money than Rome actually possessed. So they resorted to the oldest trick in the book, the same one every fiscally irresponsible empire eventually uses. They debased their currency. Emperor Nero, who ruled from 54 to 68 AD, was the first to take a significant chunk out of the denarius' silver content. He needed cash to fund his famously lavish lifestyle and costly military endeavors, so he commanded the mints to reduce the silver from nearly 100% down to 90%. That extra 10% was pure profit for the emperor. With the silver that once made 10 coins, he could now mint 11 more coins in circulation from the same amount of precious metal. It is a classic recipe for inflation. A 90% silver coin was still quite substantial, mind you. The real demolition of the currency came much later. By the reign of Emperor Caracalla in 211 AD, the denarius was down to a mere 50% silver, half value, half worthless junk metal. Fast forward to 265 AD, under Emperor Gallienus, and the silver content had plummeted to just 5%. A coin that was once the symbol of purity was now 95% base metal, with a deceptively thin silver coating. Just imagine what this meant. If you were a Roman soldier in 265 AD, your salary, paid in these new denarii, was worth a pathetic 1/20th of what your predecessors earned 2 centuries before. The government insisted nothing had changed, of course. The coins still bore the emperor's face, but their purchasing power had completely evaporated. Prices skyrocketed. An item that cost 1 denarius in 200 AD would set you back 50 denarii by 300 AD. Farmers began refusing to sell their produce for worthless coins, demanding barter instead. Soldiers mutinied, refusing to fight unless they were paid in gold or tangible goods. Tax collectors found their jobs impossible because the currency they were supposed to collect was meaningless. The entire economic engine of the empire simply seized up. And this is the crucial point. This was not the result of a foreign invasion. Rome's borders were, for the moment, still secure. This was not caused by plague or natural disaster. This was a self-inflicted wound. The Roman government systematically destroyed its own currency to finance spending it could not afford. And when the currency died, the empire died along with it. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire officially collapsed. It was not because the Germanic tribes were suddenly stronger, but because Rome could no longer pay its armies, fund its government, or maintain its infrastructure. The currency had been diluted into irrelevance, and the entire civilization built upon it came crashing down. The pattern was set. Military expansion leads to unsustainable spending, which demands currency debasement. This triggers inflation, a loss of economic function, and finally collapse. Rome proved the theory, and astoundingly, every major empire since has diligently repeated the exact same mistakes. Now, let us leap forward 12 centuries to the 1500s and the rise of the Spanish Empire. The Spanish Empire is just entering its golden age. Christopher Columbus has stumbled upon the New World. Hernán Cortés has toppled the Aztecs, and Francisco Pizarro has conquered the Incas. In one fell swoop, Spain gained control over some of the richest territories on Earth. In 1545, Spanish explorers discovered Cerro Rico, the rich mountain in Potosi, modern-day Bolivia. This was not just another silver mine. It was the single largest silver deposit ever found. For the next century, Potosi would churn out nearly half of the entire world's silver supply, millions upon millions of pounds of it. Galleons laden with treasure crossed the Atlantic, filling Spanish vaults with a degree of wealth that was previously unimaginable. Spain minted this silver into coins, and the Spanish dollar swiftly became the first truly global currency, trusted and used from Europe to Asia. It was pure, and the supply seemed infinite. Spain was now the richest and most powerful empire on the planet. At its peak, the Spanish Empire held territories on every inhabited continent. The saying "the sun never sets on the Spanish Empire" became a literal truth. And then, in a stunning act of historical déjà vu, they proceeded to destroy themselves, just like Rome. Because there is a strange paradox to money. Having more of it does not make you richer if everyone else has more of it too. As Spain flooded Europe with silver, prices began to climb uncontrollably. An item that cost 1 silver coin in 1500 cost 10 coins by 1600. The silver was just as pure. There was simply vastly more of it chasing the same amount of goods. That is the very definition of inflation. Spain was importing so much silver that it was paradoxically destroying the value of silver itself. Even worse, Spain was not actually producing anything. They were not building industries or fostering innovation. They were merely extracting wealth from their colonies and immediately spending it on endless wars, opulent palaces, and luxury goods imported from other nations. The silver would flow in from the Americas and flow right back out to France, England, and the Netherlands to pay for things Spain could not be bothered to make itself. By the late 1500s, Spain's kings were drowning in debt. King Philip II inherited a massive 36 million ducat debt from his father. Rather than exercise a shred of fiscal discipline, Philip simply borrowed more, waging wars on multiple fronts against the Ottoman Empire, Protestant rebels, and England. When the debt became unpayable, he did the unthinkable: he defaulted. In 1557, Philip II declared bankruptcy, suspending all payments on his debts. This was the first major sovereign default in modern history, but it certainly would not be the last for Spain. They defaulted again in 1560, again in 1575, and again in 1596. That is 4 defaults in just 40 years. Despite controlling half the world's silver production, the Spanish government could not pay its bills. Each default obliterated trust in the Spanish crown. Lenders refused to extend more credit, and the interest rates on Spanish debt skyrocketed. The government's response was, predictably, to debase the currency. They started minting coins with less silver and introduced copper coins that were officially declared to be as valuable as silver ones. Nobody, and I mean nobody, believed it. The currency lost all credibility. By the 1600s, Spain was in a state of terminal decline. Its military could no longer be funded, and its colonies began to break away. When the 30 Years' War concluded in 1648, Spain signed the Peace of Westphalia, a treaty that marked the beginning of the end of its dominance. By 1700, the Spanish Empire was effectively over. The country that once possessed the world's wealth had spent and borrowed itself into historical irrelevance. The pattern repeated itself perfectly. A massive influx of wealth, followed by government overspending, excessive borrowing, currency inflation, repeated defaults, a loss of confidence, and finally collapse. Spain proved that even having access to seemingly endless resources cannot save an empire from its own fiscal mismanagement. And now we turn to Britain. The British Empire lasted longer, stretched further, and controlled more wealth than Rome or Spain combined. At its peak in 1922, the empire governed 458 million people, which was 1/4 of the world's population and 1/4 of its landmass. The sun truly never set on the British Empire, not because they owned every time zone, but because their territory was so vast it was always daytime somewhere under British rule. The British pound sterling was the bedrock of this global dominion. For over 2 centuries, the pound was the world's undisputed reserve currency, with over 60% of global trade invoiced in pounds. The gold standard anchored everything. 1 pound sterling was exchangeable for a fixed quantity of gold. This system created immense trust, stability, and power. However, empires are built on credit, and all credit must eventually be repaid. Britain financed its sprawling empire through borrowing, issuing government bonds and accumulating debt to pay for wars, colonies, and administration. As long as the pound held its value and the trust remained, the system worked. But then came World War I. In 1914, Britain's national debt stood at £650 million. By 1919, after 4 grueling years of total war, it had exploded to over £7 billion. That is a 10-fold increase in just 5 years. To fund the war, Britain had borrowed from everyone: its own citizens, the United States, and anyone else willing to lend. The war also forced Britain to abandon the gold standard. In 1914, the government suspended the convertibility of pounds to gold. They simply had to print money to fund the war effort, and you cannot do that while maintaining a fixed gold backing. After the war, Britain made a valiant attempt to return to its former glory. In 1925, Winston Churchill, who was then Chancellor of the Exchequer, put Britain back on the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. This turned out to be a catastrophic blunder. The pound was massively overvalued, which made British exports uncompetitive, caused unemployment to soar, and forced the government to maintain painfully high interest rates to defend the currency, which in turn crushed economic growth. By 1931, the situation was untenable, and Britain was forced off the gold standard again, this time permanently. The pound was devalued, and the world's trust in British currency began to seriously erode. But the final, fatal blow came after the Second World War. Britain entered World War II already drowning in debt, and the war cost them everything. By 1945, the national debt had reached an astronomical 270% of GDP. The empire had bankrupted itself to achieve victory. In 1944, while the war was still raging, the Bretton Woods Conference redesigned the entire global financial system. The British pound was officially dethroned as the world's primary reserve currency, and the US dollar took its place. Britain fought desperately to preserve the pound's status, but it was a lost cause. They had the debt, but they no longer had the gold or the economic might to back their currency. What followed was a slow, agonizing, and humiliating decline. In 1949, the pound was devalued by 30%. In 1967, it was devalued again. Each devaluation wiped out savings, crushed confidence, and signaled to the world that Britain was no longer a first-rate power. At the same time, the empire disintegrated. India gained independence in 1947. Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956, and Britain's attempt at a military response was an embarrassing failure. Colony after colony broke away, not because they were conquered by some outside force, but because Britain simply could not afford to maintain them anymore. By the 1970s, Britain was on the verge of becoming a failed state. Inflation surged to 25%, and the government had to go, cap in hand, to the IMF for a bailout. The pound, once the symbol of global financial power, was now a symbol of decay. The empire that controlled a quarter of the globe had lost it all in just 30 years, not to military defeat, but to currency collapse and debt. The pattern once again is undeniable. Massive war debt, followed by currency debasement, the loss of reserve status, repeated devaluations, crippling inflation, and finally, imperial collapse. Britain proved that even the most powerful empire can fall within a single generation when its currency fails. Which, of course, brings us to today, and to the United States, the current global empire with the current reserve currency. And every single warning sign that destroyed Rome, Spain, and Britain is now flashing bright red. Let us examine the currency. The US dollar has reigned as the world's reserve currency since 1944. The Bretton Woods system established the dollar as the global standard, backed by gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Other nations pegged their currencies to the dollar, and the dollar was, quite literally, as good as gold. But just like Rome and Britain before it, the United States began spending far more money than it actually had. The Vietnam War, the Great Society social programs, and the maintenance of military bases all over the world proved enormously expensive. By the 1960s, foreign governments started to notice that America was printing far more dollars than it could possibly have gold to back them. France, under Charles de Gaulle, began demanding physical gold in exchange for its dollars. Other nations followed suit. The gold was flowing out of Fort Knox. The Great American Bluff was being called. In 1971, President Nixon slammed the gold window shut. There would be no more gold backing for the dollar. The dollar became a pure fiat currency, much like the debased Roman denarius or the British pound after 1931, backed by absolutely nothing but trust and the government's promise. Initially, this seemed to work out fine. The petrodollar system created an artificial global demand for dollars, as oil had to be purchased with them. But the spending never stopped, and the debt continued to grow. In 1980, the U.S. national debt was $900 billion. By 2000, it had swelled to $5.6 trillion. By 2020, it hit $27 trillion. Today, in 2025, it has surpassed $36 trillion. That represents a 40-fold increase in just 45 years, and the pace is only accelerating. But the debt is just one piece of the puzzle. Just like Rome debased the denarius, the United States is printing money on an unprecedented scale. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve has created trillions of dollars out of thin air. They called it quantitative easing, a fancy term for a necessary intervention to stabilize the economy. During the COVID pandemic, they printed over $4 trillion in just 2 years, creating more money than in the entire previous century combined. And just like every empire before them, they assured us it would not cause inflation, that modern economics had solved these old problems, that this time it was different. It was not different. Official inflation hit 9% in 2022. The real inflation, what you actually pay for food, housing, and healthcare, is considerably higher. The dollar is being debased, slowly at first, but the pattern always accelerates. And just like Britain, the United States is steadily losing its reserve currency status. In the year 2000, over 70% of global reserves were held in dollars. Today, that number has fallen to 58% and continues to drop. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their new members, are actively working to build alternatives to the dollar. They are trading in their own local currencies, creating new payment systems, and systematically reducing their dependence on the dollar. China and Russia are aggressively accumulating gold. Central banks all over the world are diversifying their reserves. The world is preparing for a post-dollar reality, just as it once prepared for the pound's inevitable fall. The pattern is unmistakable, and here is the most dangerous parallel of all. The United States is suffering from the exact same problem that plagued Rome, military overextension. The U.S. maintains nearly 800 military bases in over 70 countries. The annual defense budget exceeds $800 billion. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan alone cost over $8 trillion. The empire is expensive, and it is being funded with debt and printed money, a fatal combination. Just as Rome could not pay its legions with worthless coins, just as Spain could not fund its armies after repeated defaults, and just as Britain could not maintain its empire after its currency collapsed, the United States is rapidly running out of time. So let us clearly identify the 7 stages of this pattern, because once you see it, you can never unsee it. Every empire that has collapsed economically has followed this exact sequence. Not a similar one, an identical one. Stage 1 is dominance. The empire is at its absolute peak, boasting unparalleled military strength, economic power, and a trusted currency. Think of Rome with its pure denarius, Spain with its silver dollar, Britain with the gold-backed pound, and America with its own dollar. At this point, the empire appears utterly invincible. Stage 2 is overextension. The empire expands far beyond its means, taking on more territory, more military commitments, and making more promises to its citizens than it can possibly keep. Rome spread across 3 continents. Spain tried to control every ocean. Britain colonized a quarter of the globe, and America maintains a military presence on every continent. The costs inevitably become unsustainable. Stage 3 is deficit spending. The empire consistently spends more than it earns. At first, this seems manageable through borrowing and issuing bonds. But soon, the deficits become structural and permanent. Rome needed to pay its legions, Spain had to fund its wars, Britain had to finance 2 world wars, and America now runs trillion-dollar deficits every single year, even in times of economic growth. Stage 4 is currency debasement. When the empire can no longer borrow or tax enough to cover its spending, it turns to the printing press. Rome reduced the silver in its coins, Britain abandoned the gold standard and devalued the pound, and America severed the dollar's link to gold in 1971 and has been printing trillions ever since. Stage 5 is inflation. With more currency chasing the same amount of real goods, prices must rise. Rome saw prices increase 50-fold. Spain's silver imports caused price inflation across all of Europe. Britain endured 25% inflation in the 1970s. And America is experiencing significant inflation right now, despite official claims that it is merely transitory. Stage 6 is the loss of confidence. Both the domestic population and foreign nations lose faith in the currency. Roman soldiers demanded payment in gold, not their worthless denarii. Spanish creditors refused to lend after multiple defaults. The world eagerly shifted from the pound to the dollar at Bretton Woods. Today, nations are actively shifting away from the dollar. Stage 7 is collapse. The economic system fails. The currency becomes worthless or loses its dominant status. The empire can no longer fund its military or maintain control. Rome fell to tribes it could no longer pay to fight. Spain faded into irrelevance. Britain lost its empire in decades. And the United States? Well, that is the question we are all living through right now. That is the pattern. 7 stages, repeated 4 times across 2,000 years. Different empires, different continents, and different currencies, but the exact same sequence of events. Because the fundamental math never changes. You cannot spend more than you earn forever. You cannot print your way to prosperity. And you cannot debase your currency without facing the consequences. We are firmly in stage 5 and accelerating rapidly towards stage 6. So what happens next? History suggests 3 possible outcomes. First is a controlled decline, like Britain after 1945. They lost the empire and the reserve currency, endured painful inflation, but the country itself did not disappear. It was a slow, humiliating adjustment to being a second-tier power, but not a total collapse. The second possibility is a chaotic collapse, like Rome in the 5th century. The currency becomes worthless, the government loses control, and the empire fragments, ushering in a dark age. This is the worst-case scenario, a complete systemic breakdown that is not just economic, but social and political as well. Third, there could be a reset and restructure. A new currency system is established, perhaps backed by gold again, or maybe a new reserve currency emerges from the chaos. The old system dies, but a new one replaces it with relative speed. This outcome is painful, but ultimately survivable. The United States is now at this very crossroads. The debt simply cannot be repaid, not at current levels and certainly not with current spending habits. The only real options left are default, inflation, or a complete restructuring. Default would destroy the dollar's global dominance instantly. Inflation is already happening and is likely to accelerate. And a restructuring would require a level of political will that, to be blunt, does not currently exist. What makes this time different is that Rome, Spain, and Britain were regional empires. The US dollar, however, is the global reserve currency. When the Roman denarius collapsed, it primarily affected the Roman Empire. When the dollar collapses, it will affect the entire world. Every central bank, every trade agreement, every financial market is tied to it. Our interconnected global economy will amplify both the impact and the chaos. But the pattern says it is coming, not because of a prediction, but because of historical precedent. Rome debased its currency to pay its legions. The denarius died and the empire fell. Spain flooded the world with silver. Inflation destroyed its wealth and the empire declined. Britain borrowed to fight 2 world wars. The pound collapsed and the empire dissolved. And now the United States prints trillions, runs endless deficits, and somehow believes it is different. It is not different. The pattern does not care about notions of American exceptionalism. It does not care about military strength or technological advancement. The pattern is purely economic, and economic laws are as absolute as the laws of physics. You cannot print wealth, you cannot borrow forever, and you cannot debase your currency without ultimately destroying your empire. 4 empires, 4 collapses, 4 identical patterns. The only question left is one of timing. How long until we reach stage 6? How long until the world completely loses confidence in the dollar? How long until the American empire follows Rome, Spain, and Britain into the history books? The pattern says we are close. The debt says we are close. The money printing says we are close. History, which has watched this exact sequence play out 4 times before, says the ending is inevitable. The only variable is how fast and how painful it will be. If this gave you a new perspective on our current situation, subscribe to the channel, because when this pattern finally completes its cycle, you will want to understand what happened and, more importantly, why. History holds all the answers, and the pattern never lies.